Like Trotsky said, you may not be interested in the war, but the war is interested in you.
So we can get started now. Welcome to the second event of the Conservatives for Ukraine Speakers Bureau with Claire Lopez, Victor Rudd, Jeffrey Nyquist, and Trevor Loudon. My name is Lauren Morris, and I'm moderating again for this event. And we're going to be directing some questions tonight to the panel. And the first question is, are the current deterrences being utilized by the US and the EU having an effect on the spread of a greater horizontal war? And how do you think what's happening in the overall war in Ukraine right now being viewed by China?
Well, we can dispense with the first question very quickly. There is no deterrence. It's gone. It was never there. And that's why we're in the war. Now we can go to question number 2.
Well, I think China is encouraged at the moment and will be getting ready to their own adventures because they're clearly seeing that the weak link here is the United States. The United States is not stepping up. It's not rallying the troops. It's not delivering what it's supposed to deliver. And it looks like, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the other no-win wars that the American elites have snatched, where they've snatched, defeat from the jaws of victory. That's how the Chinese would be viewing this right now, I think.
I should mention what sources of mine have said about it, sources that have intel on China. Before there was a war in Ukraine, I had sources in Southeast Asia saying that the government of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos were told by the Russians and Chinese that there was a war coming with the West, and that Russia and China would be united in this war, and that they were told to take certain precautions to put leadership cadre in bunkers. And this was something that was given to me by someone with, connections there. I didn't know what to make of that. Then a year ago, let's see, now it's 2 years ago, May, Elmer Yuan, a Hong Kong businessman who had developed contacts in the Chinese Communist Party, said that these contacts had just told him that China was planning a war, a kinetic war against the United States, because it had certain problems in its economy and it wanted to create some kind of conflict in the Pacific. Specifically, what kind is unclear, but they wanted that. And of course, there were. There was the 57-minute leaked military civil fusion meeting in Guangdong in May of 2022 after the Ukrainian invasion, in which these officials talked about actual kinetic war with the United States and how they would deploy the People's Armed Police and the army in the province. And it was really interesting. And I interviewed Mr. Wang of Luda Media, who got a hold of this recording. And he talked about China wanting this, what he described was a kind of pressure on Taiwan and a low-key conflict that could erupt into war. But if the US showed weakness, they would just exploit that weakness politically, force the United States to retreat from the Western Pacific, abandon specifically South Korea and Japan and Australia, which was kind of interesting. And of course, I misunderstood him at the time. He seemed to suggest that it was a blockade, but he was really saying tightening the screws without actually causing a military conflict, but to come very close to a blockade and then eventually to cause some kind of military crisis. In my more recent interview with him, he spoke about the Chinese wanting to get an American aircraft carrier, to use that to humiliate the United States. and some kind of ambush situation. And he explained Russia's role in this, that they wanted Russia, the Chinese have wanted Russia to put this pressure on NATO to free them up to do this. And I heard the same thing, by the way, from the Southeast Asian sources in 2020. So I've heard this now for almost 4 years. I've been getting this stuff out of China, that China wants this aggressive thing. And I don't know, like maybe Victor Rudd could comment, there's the FSB, what do they call it? The FSB papers coming out of France. I don't know how much credibility Victor attaches to those, but there was a claim in those papers that China was trying to get Russia to agree to some kind of conflict with Japan before Russia went into Ukraine. So, it's almost like, you look at Hitler before World War II, he had all kinds of scenarios in his head about how he was going to gain certain territories. And I was hearing similar things out of Russia, although my sources there dried up. So but what I did hear was the Russians were being pushed. I heard from the Russian side that as early as the fall of 2020, the Russians were being pushed to do something military. And the Russians kept saying, we're not ready, we're not ready. And I will note that before Putin invaded Ukraine, he went to Beijing in February of 2022 and met with Xi, and they announced this partnership that was the strongest combination, they said, since World War II. So maybe others can comment on this, but you don't know what sources, how accurate they are, where they're getting this from. But I thought it would be interesting to mention this.
Well, let me jump in a little bit. I'd like to take this outside for a moment, outside of the framework, Jeff, that you just mentioned, and Trevor as well, and look at it from a different perspective, which is, we all know, or we should all know and understand, but I say we, I'm talking about collectively, just generically, that before you get to the issue of deterrence as a matter of hardware, capability, capacity to inflict unacceptable harm on the other side, you have to talk and you have to understand the mind and the psychology controlling the finger on the trigger. And China, Moscow, a long, long time ago, China, of course, Iran and others, they have us, I think, figured down pat very, very accurately. We are, almost by our DNA, we are not very inclined to set a goal for ourselves in a foreign policy area other than to manage and to keep things, quote unquote, stable. We're going to run away from anything that's going to smack of upsetting things. We're apoplectic right now about the possibility of the Russian so-called Federation dissolving in one way or the other, as we were back in the days of the Soviet Union. And our DNA for stability, that explains a lot of why we look the other way in Chechnya, in Georgia, and Moldova before that, Ukraine in 2014. That's one aspect. And we don't have a goal as we had. We had an anti-Hitler alliance in World War II. We don't have that with Putin. We do not have an anti-Putin alliance to remove him, to cause a Russian defeat in any real sense of the word. The other part of this is a tremendous amount of hypocrisy that we telegraph unintentionally. But when we talk about, the rules-based order, Biden wrote about it as a candidate in Foreign Affairs magazine during the campaign, and accurately, that we were the ones who were basically the architect of that order after World War II. And yet, at the same time, what did we do in the 1990s? We ran roughshod over the UN's rules and pushed Russia into the National Security Council, tossing the rules out of the window. We did nothing in 2014 and afterwards other than to sanction, in the sense of approve of the Minsk protocols, which defenestrated the rules-based order pretty much as much as you could. So you wrap it all up, I don't think there is a whole hell of a lot of or not as much deterrence, not nearly as much as we could have wielded. And another factor, for example, I'm jumping around a little bit, but it just comes to mind. Yeah, China depends on the West. Look at the amount of trade, but on the other hand, so do we, right? We're not dependent on Russia, and yet we are so, we dance gingerly around it. Well, I made the point last time we talked. Well, what about China? Right? The American public, they need their prescriptions filled at CVS and Walgreens. Where do you think that stuff comes from? The leverage that China has on us, I think, is massive. It's huge. And I'm not ready to roll the dice to say, well, China needs us more than we need them. I don't think that we have a whole hell of a lot of credibility at all. We've blown the opportunities time and time again with Russia. This is not, it's been declared, as you know, not as just a territorial war by Russia against Ukraine. This is, as Putin has said, it is intended to destroy our order. It is also openly genocidal, openly. We've never had a war like this before, where it has been articulated, the purpose has been articulated as clearly. So if we can't get our head together and get our head around what we should be doing with Ukraine now, I think that extrapolates into a very, very poor message for China and for others. We could throw in the Budapest Memorandum and everything else, but again, I am not sanguine about how serious China is taking us in the Pacific.
Lauren, very quickly about China. It's not just in the Pacific. It's not just over there in Asia. They're here.
Yes.
We've got tens and tens of thousands of young, fit, military-aged Chinese men, some of them identified as members of the PLA's, People Liberation Army Special Battalion, Jungle Tigers. And they're inside the country. They're here. And they're waiting for orders, probably organizing into cells right now. This is not just about over there. This is already inside the homeland.
Yeah,
and a similar situation exists in Canada, and several other countries as well. So, I think we're going to see trouble on our streets this summer. If not this summer, if Trump gets elected, the day after he gets elected, there'll be chaos, I believe. Right through that lame duck period. So, this is I think the whole Ukraine war must be seen in a global context, and that's the big problem the American Republicans have. All they see it is it's like they think it's Burundi fighting the Congo or something. They think it's some little conflict way over there. They don't see Ukraine as the gateway to Europe. They don't see that China is watching like a hawk what happens, as is Iran, as is North Korea, as are the communist regimes of Latin America. So I see this as a battle for the world balance of power, and it's not going in our favor at the moment.
Yeah.
And how much does the American electorate grasp or comprehend any of this?
They don't.
That's right.
I mean, if they could even find Ukraine on a map, I think, we'd be pleased.
They can't. They don't even know where and what Ukraine is.
No.
The Europeans, at least, have a bit more, even with the change of generations, they still have a bit more of a institutional memory of World War II and a far better sense of history and geography, but we are totally afield. And this is going to come as a huge, huge shock. that CBS 60 Minutes program on the Havana syndrome.
Mhm.
That was clear as day, even before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the amount of research that was being done on that kind of weaponry, and since then, and yet nobody wants to believe. We talk about nuclear conflagration. When is the last time anybody talked about Russia's chem bio capabilities? And I'm sure China's as well.
Well,
Yeah, and
I should mention you might have seen in the news that on the 30th, there was a claim that a giant vacuum bomb was exploded in Sumy Oblast.
It
And of
wasn't the
course,
first time. Yes, I
and it
know.
wasn't the first time. Yeah, that's what Budanov said. It was not the first time. Um, and and of course, the Ukrainians were a little bit careful about the details. And I know some more details about it. The bomb was not exactly exploded where they said it was, but the Russians demonstrated this very brutal bomb, and a lot of people were killed by this bomb. In fact, they exploded it in a way that even killed their own troops. And this is rather striking, but it shows the brutality of the Russians. And then really, people don't understand what Russia has done with in terms of Russian deterrence, in terms of Belarus and um, its own territory next to Sumy, where that bomb went off. That territory, Belgorod has been targeted by Ukrainian troops that have crossed into Russia. And Russia wants to make sure that it doesn't have to defend its territory or even worry about an invasion of its ally Belarusia. They want to make sure that they can strike at Ukraine in its flanks anytime they want, but nobody can strike back. And this is again reminiscent of the Vietnam War. And so they moved nuclear weapons into Belarus last summer. And this sort of makes that territory so that no NATO force and no Ukrainian is going to enter that territory. And they used this bomb right there on the border where Belgorod is, where Ukrainian troops are crossing over into Russia to harass because Russia wants to concentrate its troops for attack. It doesn't want to spread out and defend itself over that territory. And so this is what they've done. And it's a very interesting commentary on how they operate and how we don't, because in NATO, all these countries have talked a hard line, but it's the small countries that seem to be preparing. Whereas the French have promised they're going to build up their military. The Germans promised and failed in that promise. And the British military, as I understand it, is basically not building itself up. And we know what the US is doing about it. So I think NATO is failing right now. I think Victor is right. And there's no reason to be optimistic right now.
On the other hand, Russia has lost numerous commanders and generals and colonels. They've been slaughtered in the field. The Wagner group pulled out of the Donbass. They are training some of the Belarusian soldiers that are there, but we really don't have any idea, I don't think, how well Russia is doing with its command. The siege that Ukraine put on the Black Sea at Sevastopol, where they killed about 30 of their admirals and leaders, there it was a huge slaughter. It was a big defeat for Russia, I think. How long can they go on with these strategic strikes by Ukraine that have been so successful at their
Well,
command?
maybe Victor can comment on this, and also Trevor. The Russians announced, Sergei Shoigu announced, they are raising 14 new divisions and 16 new brigades, effectively what amounts to 2 field armies worth of troops, new formations, in addition to recruiting for the losses of the other armies that are in the front. And this is a remarkable thing. They claim they can do it by the end of the year. I'm not sure if that's, they really can, but I'm told that the Chinese have been sending the machine tools have been building up. They've been building up their military industry. We'll see how effective they are, but the Russians do have depth. And although the Russian military formations are pretty sloppy and have not performed well, if you throw these things together, I guess you'll have more of the same thing, not terribly good. And will that win the war for them? And I just wondered if anybody wanted to comment on that.
Yeah,
Well,
look
you
at
go,
it
you
this
go.
way. We can't project our implicit, often unarticulated values onto Moscow in terms of body count, vast human losses in the military, so on and so forth. We're affected by that. We're swayed by that. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference for them. Number two, it isn't a war that is military against military. It is the Russian military against the population, primarily the population of Ukraine. They want to undercut it. There is a goal and there is a purpose to what they're doing, which is one of the reasons for their mobilization, which we don't have, we don't share, neither does Europe. They have a goal and a purpose, we don't. What is our goal? What's our purpose? What is it? Right? You can't, for example, as we did with Ukraine, you can't disarm Ukraine, both of its nukes and its conventional weaponry. And now the third step being telling the Ukrainians, no, you can't strike Russian energy facilities because it's on Russian territory. Well, then what else is anybody supposed to do, right? If sanctions haven't interdicted the money raising capability of Russia through its continuing energy sales, then the Ukrainians are trying to do it by going to the source of that. And even that is something that we don't want to happen. So I ask you, what's our purpose? What's our goal? How do you, what do you continue with this forever? It can't. It can't continue forever, obviously. They're going to run out of blood.
Well, see, this is the thing. The main front in the war is the US Congress and US public opinion. That's the main front. And the Russians have probably spent as much money influencing American public opinion as they have, putting troops in the field. And so we've got a very divided Congress now. And, thanks to people like Tucker Carlson and others, the few good ones in there who actually see the consequences don't dare to speak loudly about them. So we now have a situation where the Republicans are going to be blamed for cutting off funding to Ukraine, and if Ukraine inevitably falls, Biden can blame the Republicans in election year, and if Ukraine still manages to win, Biden can claim credit for it. It's a very, very, very double game that he's playing right now. And so I think, putting pressure on the US Congress is the key way forward right now. And I'm not sure how that can be done, but that's really where the battle's going to be decided, I think.
We haven't had a Pearl Harbor moment yet. Neither we nor what we will call the traditional Europe. That hasn't happened yet. But when it does, I don't think we're going to have the opportunity, as I said last time, for redemption. We did it after World War II, Korean War, so on and so forth. I think it's going to be too late.
So is that going to look like Russia striking Poland? Is that going to be the Pearl Harbor moment? When does American power take a leading position? Because right now they feel that Russia's mass is going to overwhelm Ukraine no matter what. And they do that in the informational space as much as they do it on the battlefield. And that's why our Congress is just being mowed over. So what is that Pearl Harbor moment going to look like?
Well, I don't know, Claire or somebody. I don't want to monopolize this Q&A.
Yeah, no, I'm not seeing a Pearl Harbor moment coming. I think this is a slow grinding war. It'll continue that way for the foreseeable future.
I think it's important to remember we're not dealing with countries in Russia and China that want to follow the path of Japan and Germany in World War II, which is to commit acts of aggression that actually cause the rest of the world to mobilize against them. I think they've been very smart in their microaggressions, I guess you could call them. And Ukraine is kind of the largest one we've seen, and it's kind of surprising. But I think they thought they were going to take the country quickly.
Yeah, I have to jump in here. Excuse me for any interruption. The Pearl Harbor moment isn't, I did not intend that to suggest literally bombs are falling in your backyard. I intended that to be an awakening, something that will awaken us, but it will not happen precisely, Claire, because as you just said, it is the insidious, corrosive disintegration of societies and the implicit capitulation that's going to happen step by step in many, many theaters in many, many areas for us and for others in the energy and other areas. And eventually things just sort of freeze up. I'm not saying, again, that the Pearl Harbor moment necessarily means there's going to be a missile attack on London. And it is difficult for us to conceive that something can degenerate that far. Putin crossed the Potomac a long time ago. We're not aware of it. We're convinced that Russian mass will win, and therefore, well, let the Ukrainians sort of do the best that they can and come to some sort of agreement. We, again, are making the same mistake we made 30, 35 years ago. We are oblivious to who and what constitutes the Russian Federation and the fissures and the tensions that exist there. You think we have splits and contradictions in our society? The Russian Federation is much, much worse, except that there's a lid on it. But the explosive nature of it is there and it's simmering. We're oblivious to it. We think it's just one big unitary country. It's not. It's the inner core of that evil empire. The second core, of course, was the Soviet Union, and the outer core was the East European countries.
Yeah, that's a good point, Victor, because when you're dealing with an empire, there's something about the way they're put together that they're not organic. And so they're always having to expand or do more or strengthen because they're always threatened by this inner problem that they always have.
The next question is, with the Ukrainian loss, what does Russian control of the Black Sea mean for the rest of the world?
Well, the Russians do not control much of the Black Sea. They've been chased out of there, even without Ukraine even having a navy. Much of the Russian presence previous to the war in the Black Sea has now slipped back through the Kerch Strait into the Sea of Azov. And Ukraine has now been able to access its southern ports again and to export its food crops, especially grain and also seed oils. So the Russians have really taken quite a few hits in the Black Sea.
But I think, Claire, what I was getting that if Ukraine loses and Russia regains control of that area, what leverage does that give them over the rest of the world? Food supplies. Look, to me, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they crossed the Rubicon. They were never going to be part of the civilized world order again, meaning to me that they intend to dominate it. They said, right, we're going for broke now. We're going to do this because we know we can never come back. We can never come back to this friendly order where we can get lots of money from the Americans and all this kind of thing. So if they did dominate the Black Sea, they would use that to create chaos in North Africa, like they're already doing in Africa right now, to consolidate, to cause starvation, which will cause revolutions, which they will then control. So yeah, it'd be I think the attack on the world food supply would be a big part of that. Food supply, fertilizer, all of that would be then even more under Russian control than it is now.
Well, not only that, but if that is allowed, if it's tolerated, which it has been, Then, of course, we have the maritime consequences, the Straits of Japan, the Straits of Taiwan with China. But as well, I'll go back to Vyacheslav Molotov, whose name everybody will recognize. Back in the 30s, he had argued with Stalin that the Soviet Union should raise claims against Alaska or for Alaska against the United States. That's been raised periodically for the last 15 years in the Russian Duma, and it's becoming a more frequent issue. You know, that the reality show on television, Most Dangerous Catch, the American crab fishermen in the Bering Straits, it's precisely that area and the U.S. territorial waters off of Alaska, which I suspect are going to be challenged quite directly by Russia. And there's no reason for them not to do it. Why not?
Exactly. And with the rise of all these militia groups that work for them, they have, it's almost like a new era, it seems. So the Wagner group down in Africa leveraging as much control as they can. It's a new world of terrorism, I think, that we are entering in. The next question that I have concerns the information space. Do you think that the criticisms based on open sources and media, criticisms against China and Russia from the public, including Elon Musk, do they have any impact at all on how Russia and China are going to conduct this war going forward?
No, I think it's affirmation that they're doing the right job for themselves.
Because it sure seems to have an effect on our leadership here in the United States.
Well,
Yeah,
remember,
well-
they're controlled societies, and the amount of information that gets in or gets out is tightly controlled by the regimes themselves in Moscow and Beijing, which is very much unlike our own media space. However, you know, the problems that we've had with it lately of the last few years, but still, by comparison, by contrast, you know, the openness, the availability of information to influence people one way or another is so different here in the United States and even the rest of the West than in either China or Russia.
I think what's interesting, Claire, about their influence is that they're perfectly aware that we are a society with many points of views and many parties. And so Russia in particular has different propaganda messages for different groups.
Yeah.
And they have infiltrated. I believe it's not, I mean, their active measures are not simply to send information from Russia to people, but to have people who seem to be independent operators in the West presenting messages that help them, but these people do not necessarily represent themselves as Russian agents.
Well, they may
And I
not
think
realize that they are.
They may not.
may be
Well, anybody
unwittingly
can, yeah,
recruited.
right. Anybody can pass along these words. So I think for the sophistication of their active measures, which the Russians were very good at during the Cold War, we don't realize the extent to which the right in America has been, you know, our larger problem, of course, is that our dummies of the left and right form two perfect halves of a self-destructing whole. And the left has little regard for our economy or social order or military survival, and the right has less and less regard for collective security, military alliances, and the real balance of power. So they play that off, and they use this divide and conquer strategy. I think we have to recognize that.
Russia has essentially attacked the American public's cognitive resistance. And one of the best examples that I can think of is after what happened in Bucha and Irpin, Sergei Lavrov came out and he said that those were Zelensky's troops. Those weren't Russian troops that committed those massacres in Bucha. And that had an effect on the American public. So at least we have some kind of an avenue here to combat those false narratives.
Yeah, and there's I think we haven't had the discussion about the way that the Russian special services have infiltrated and used anti-Semitic narratives, conspiracy theory narratives, in Europe, in Germany, in the US. And we haven't had nobody really has had the discussion how at the end of World War II, the Nazi diaspora was captured by Soviet agents, and how that has been an element for false flag recruitment of people on the far right for the last 50 years. I go back to Francis Parker Yockey and his biography, how he worked with the KGB. This was a leading American Nazi thinker back in the 1950s, and he went to East Germany. His biographers believe, and he worked with the KGB. And when you go to Alexander Dugin and his Eurasianism, this was the same Eurasianism that Francis Parker Yockey was pushing. And so when we see anti-Semitic people pushing, talking always about the Rothschilds and the evil capitalist insiders, they are trying to make the bad guys, the capitalists, the West, the same old villains that the Soviet Union had, and somehow have that coming from the right. And this is how they're co-opting the right in America, is they're trying to move the right towards this conspiracy theory narratives, talking against the Rothschilds and so on. This older, it's recognizable as structurally similar to the anti-Semitism of the Nazis and the fascists in World War II, but it's been modified. It's been updated.
Yeah, we the
Yeah.
American people, we have zero counterintelligence awareness, and our leadership also lacks that awareness terribly. So we not only don't recognize when narratives, info ops, psy ops are directed at us, we don't know how to do it back at them either.
Yeah, no, we don't. And what's remarkable to me is that I thought that the right was better put together looking back to the 1980s and 90s, but it really fragmented after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's become extremely easy prey for this strategy.
Mhm.
Granted, they've had 30 years to infiltrate and work on it, but I watched over the last 30 years them doing this, being aware of this history, and I am amazed. They have been very successful, and I've lost more than half my readers because they have succumbed to this. And I've gotten lots of emails and even calls from people, and it's like, you've been reading me how long, and you have now gone over to this? Do you realize where this comes from? They don't.
So with events in the Middle East having eclipsed the evening news and other coverage out of Ukraine, in addition now to that problem, how do you recoup any kind of understanding, as de minimis as it may have been on the part of the electorate about Ukraine? The question is, okay, so what do we do about it? Bad enough if we go back a year ago, but now basically, I'm sure if I went outside, I'll give you dollars to donuts, that if I was going to ask any passerby about Ukraine, he says, oh, you'll probably say, oh, I thought it was all over already. There's no coverage. If we don't see it, it doesn't exist. What's to be done in addition to what we're doing now?
The thing is, there aren't very many others like us. There are other small groups like, what is that one called? Republicans
Yeah.
for Ukraine. I think that's a group
Yes.
similar to ours.
Yes.
But
There's one
aside
more.
from that, there
Go
aren't any other groups that I know of. And just try to get through to any member of Congress. You need a battering ram to get through their staff. You'll never make it.
It's fortunate on the one hand that there was, again, I don't know how many people view 60 Minutes, but I imagine they have a pretty good following. And we had that disclosure reporting last Sunday about the Havana syndrome.
Yeah, I've been doing media on that ever since. As a matter of fact, I did One America News just yesterday, and I did another podcast on that today as well. But how many people does that reach? A few thousand maybe.
Yeah. And on the other side of the seesaw, you have the weight of Senator Vance, who just poo-poos everything. And this is a senator. You would have thought he would have said, well, if it's true, it's serious, we better confirm it and find out. And yet, that's not his reaction.
Well, JD Vance is terrible when it comes to anything to do with foreign policy, but he's still, see, this is the thing where at a state where you've got Tulsi Gabbard and JD Vance both on the list of possible VP candidates.
Right,
Both
precisely
of
the point.
both of whom shouldn't be able to even get a basic background clearance. You know, yeah, the thing is, there is a wall of people around Trump who are of the pro-Russian bent. You know, that is the reality. And, you know, this is, you know, I could name several of them, but they have been, you know, you got the Colonel McGregor going to the White House. You got Donald Trump Jr. calling Colonel McGregor a great American patriot. You know, so there's a real, the Russians have done a great job of putting their people in place, really, or selling us a narrative.
We're simply not a sophisticated people. We're a very naive people here in America, especially in the West overall.
Grossly.
We're naive and unsophisticated.
And Claire, unfortunately, it's almost become congenital in the sense that it's been that way for generations. There's been no learning curve, you know, from one generation to the other. It's remained either flat or it's gone down.
But there
That's
was a time, I think, back especially maybe during the Reagan presidency years and in the 50s when there were congressional committees, House Un-American Activities Committee, Senator Joseph McCarthy's committee on the Senate side, when people were more aware of what's going on, eons, I mean, orders of magnitude more aware than they are today.
right. No, I understand, of course. Of course, you could also ask the question, why in the world was it all such a big shock and such a big awakening when you know, it was clear already in the 20s and the 30s what was happening and where it was all going, right? And people beating the drum and that was ignored. And then pow, all of a sudden, oh wow, well, you know, I didn't think that that would be a problem. You know, Stalin gets nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Who did that?
Well, I think modern technology in those days, it would have been television, played a big role in the 50s and even in, you know, on further on. But today that technology perhaps has been commandeered by you know, the opponents, not by the good guys.
And yet, for some reason, we can't replicate that, right? And redirect the airwaves 180 degrees. For some reason, Hollywood is incompetent when it comes to, you know, putting on that kind of message.
Oh,
And
they're
I
not
mean Hollywood
incompetent.
very
They're bought and
generically, I'm
paid
saying
for.
us
Yeah.
working you know, working psyops.
Yeah,
Like,
no,
not
China.
just
I mean,
against Russia,
Hollywood
but
used to
China as
make,
well.
yeah, Hollywood used to make, you know, patriotic movies. You know, President Ronald Reagan got his start in some of those.
Right.
They came out, you know, one after another. But today, Hollywood is literally bought and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party.
Mhm.
Well, everything is intrinsic to our system of government and capitalism. You can't really, I mean, look, when the US government puts out any kind of propaganda, people go, oh no, you're trying to brainwash the American people. So we have basic problems. And the other problem is there has been a lowering of standards. I think it was Neil Postman in 1985. He wrote the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, that we are now in a post-literate society. People don't read. They get everything from TV. And when Victor says, what should we do? You know, everybody here, we're kind of educators. I write, we all do videos like this, but the problem is we're not network news. We don't have all that money and all that capitalism behind us. And so we would have to raise a lot of money. We would have to get some powerful voices behind us, and we would have to turn into instant celebrities somehow in order to have that effect. And then we'd still be going up against a machine that has been very successful decade after decade of grinding forward without really serious organized resistance to its messages.
Well, to be a little bit optimistic, in terms of, there being groups and other people like us, they do exist, but they are on the other side of the pond. And so that is why I digest the news that I digest from over there. Claire's right when she says we are not a sophisticated people, because when I go out and about and I run into people in Texas where I live, people are stunned and they're shocked and they don't know what's happening to them. And then, the next thing you hear them talking about, they're saying something about Biden or they're saying something about Trump. So they're focused on the president and they're completely clueless about what's going on in the rest of the world. So,
But the important thing there is not just that they don't know what's going on in the rest of the world, but they don't understand that what is happening over there affects back home here and does affect them even down to the community and the family level. But they have no concept of the connectivity of events from there to here. And that's something we've got to work on, maybe in our messaging, how that affects us.
right.
Yeah, the classic line is, why worry about Ukraine's border when we've got our own that's wide open? But, people don't make the connection that the same people are pushing on both borders effectively. And so, what we're faced with is a slowly grinding away Russia-Chinese bloc that is just going to keep on making gains without doing anything too dramatic to galvanize the world against them. I think they probably got a bit of a shock over the way that NATO did rise up a little, over Ukraine, but they've just sort of kept riding through that to try and hope it'll just dissipate. And America's sort of helping that process along. So, I think there's going to have to be some miracles here, because this is going to be a slow process where they're going to get the upper hand, and we're just going to lose ground and lose ground and lose ground. And that is the problem. They're not going to be stupid enough to set off an atomic bomb in Chicago tomorrow. No. Or something like that. They'll do riots, like Black Lives Matter was a Chinese operation, but most Americans would have no comprehension of that. They just think it's just crazy people, burning down cities because they got nothing better to do. They don't see this as part of a whole. So obviously we got to keep trying to do what we can to connect the dots for people and hope that there is some breakthrough, that the enemy makes a mistake here or there. The enemy does things that, like I think the way they did Ukraine was a mistake. They were overconfident and they didn't take into account the resistance of the Ukrainian people. But we got to hope for more mistakes like that, and we got to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and networking where we can. And I think there's going to be a bit of praying for miracles there too, to be honest.
Let's just go back one more point, Trevor. I want to expand on this example that you raised about, a nuke going off in Chicago or whatever it is. Let's assume something like that, or of lower intensity, confirmed poisoning of water sources, a nuclear power plant, whatever. The issue that's going to become apparent immediately is, again, our national psychology. Because the first thing that will happen is people are going to say, well, who did it? How do we know? Prove it to me, show me. Washington is going to be massively reluctant to identify anybody because there's going to be so much dust thrown into the air. We have a compulsion. Well, what's one side? What's the other side of the story? Let's hear it all the way around. There almost can't be, I think, any definitive reaction against that, which is something, therefore, that could actually maybe entice something like this, something that is dramatic, but yet sufficiently amorphous that avoids the direct reprisal.
Well, see, my theory, if you go back to the 60s, you know, I think the intelligence was pretty strong that the Russians had a big hand in the Kennedy assassination. But the American government wouldn't want to say they did, because at that time that would have meant war.
Just like the Havana syndrome.
Mm. So you've got to deflect this, you know, you've got to not have a confrontation. So, you know, what I meant by, you know, like if the Chinese just started sending boatloads of soldiers into Hawaii, that would probably be enough to galvanize people.
Well, that's clear enough, sure.
That's clear. But as you say, a terrorist attack, well, we still don't, but we still haven't blamed China for the COVID yet. Everybody knows they did it. But you're not allowed to blame them, because then you'd have to cut the trade with China. Then you'd have to have repercussions. Then you'd have to call people to account, and Wall Street would not be happy. You know, so there is that. We are willing accomplices to our own victimization. So that's another factor to take into account.
Amusing ourselves to death.
You know, things do look pretty bleak right now for Ukraine and for Europe and for the West. But they're still fighting. They're still committed. You know, there's still some people in Europe who understand the consequences here. And I think the thing we've got to really work on is American public opinion. That's got to be our number one priority. Because if America was fully committed to winning this war, it would have been won by now.
It wouldn't have occurred.
Well, that's more truthful, isn't it? You know, it never would have happened. And so
once we said it's okay to annex Crimea, it's downhill after that.